Westbrook High School was known across New York for its prestige. Nestled in an affluent neighborhood with wide tree-lined streets and houses that looked more like mansions than homes, the school carried a reputation of excellence, privilege, and opportunity. The hallways gleamed with polished floors. The classrooms were equipped with state-of-the-art technology, and most of the students arrived each morning in luxury cars driven by chauffeurs. To the outside world, Westbrook represented the very best of education. But like so many places of privilege, beneath the surface it also carried shadows of prejudice, pride, and unspoken divisions. Among the hundreds of students walking those pristine halls was a boy who didn't seem to belong by the school's usual standards. His name was Jamal Carter. He was a sophomore, just 15 years old, and unlike many of his classmates, he didn't come from money or legacy. Jamal's family lived across town in a modest apartment in Brooklyn. His mother, Denise, worked long hours as a nurse at the local hospital, while his father, Marcus, split his time between shifts at a warehouse and driving for a rideshare company just to keep the bills paid. They didn't have much, but what they had was love, resilience, and the unshakable belief that Jamal deserved every chance to succeed. Jamal had earned his place at Westbrook through a full academic scholarship. His grades had always been exceptional, his determination unmatched, and when the opportunity for a scholarship presented itself, his teachers back in middle school had pushed him to apply. To their delight and to Jamal's own disbelief, he had been accepted. From that moment, his parents reminded him every day that this wasn't just a seat in a classroom. It was a door to a brighter future. Still, being one of the very few black students in a predominantly white, wealthy environment was not easy. Jamal faced the subtle stares, the whispers, and sometimes the outright dismissive comments from classmates who couldn't understand why someone like him belonged there. He wasn't bullied in the traditional sense, but the constant reminder that he was different weighed heavily on him. He dressed simply because his family couldn't afford designer labels. He didn't talk about vacations or private tutors because those things were out of reach. Instead, Jamal focused on what he could control: his studies, his goals, and a quiet talent that only a handful of people knew about. What no one at Westbrook realized, not the students, not the teachers, and certainly not Principal Robert Holloway, was that Jamal had a gift. Music wasn't just a hobby for him. It was his sanctuary. Back home, his grandmother had an old upright piano in her living room. The wood was scratched, the keys yellowed with age, and some of them stuck when pressed, but to Jamal, that piano was treasure. From the time he was 7 years old, he would spend hours sitting at it, teaching himself to play by ear. His grandmother had once been a gospel singer, and she had introduced him to songs filled with soul, passion, and rhythm. Slowly, with patience and persistence, Jamal had developed a skill that went far beyond simple practice. He became a prodigy. Music flowed through him, not as notes on a page, but as emotion translated into sound. The problem was, Jamal never showed that side of himself at school. He was quiet, reserved, and kept his head down, fearing that if he revealed too much of who he was, it would only give others more reasons to mock him. But fate has a way of bringing hidden gifts to light, especially when no one expects it. The day of the annual school celebration arrived when students, parents, and staff gathered for what was meant to be a cheerful showcase of Westbrook's community spirit. The event was held in the auditorium, with its gleaming stage, heavy red curtains, and a grand piano positioned right at the center. There were speeches, performances, and even a talent show portion where select students showcased their skills. For most, it was an opportunity to shine. For Jamal, it was just another reminder that he didn't fit in. He planned to sit quietly in the back, clap when appropriate, and go home as soon as possible. But Principal Holloway had other plans. Known for his sharp suits, his booming voice, and his reputation as a man who valued appearances above all else. Holloway thrived on maintaining the school's image of superiority. He enjoyed being the center of attention, and often that meant subtly belittling those who didn't fit his mold of Westbrook excellence. When his eyes scanned the audience that day and landed on Jamal, an idea crossed his mind, a cruel one disguised as humor. The performances had just finished, and the energy in the auditorium was high. Parents clapped, students whispered, and everyone awaited the principal's closing remarks. That's when Holloway stepped up to the microphone, and with a smirk curling across his face, called Jamal to the stage. The boy froze in his seat, stunned. Whispers erupted instantly among the students. Why Jamal? He hadn't signed up to perform, and everyone knew he wasn't part of the event. Come on up here. Jamal, the principal said, his tone laced with condescension. Let's give this young man a chance to entertain us. How about you play us something on the piano? The words hung in the air like a trap. Some students chuckled quietly, while others exchanged confused glances. Everyone knew what was happening. It was a setup. Holloway expected Jamal to stumble, to sit there awkwardly in front of the crowd, unable to play a single note. It was meant to humiliate him, to remind everyone of his place. Jamal's heart raced. His palms grew sweaty, and for a moment he considered shaking his head and refusing. But then he thought of his parents, of the sacrifices they made for him to be at this school, of the nights his father worked overtime, of the mornings his mother left before sunrise, exhausted but determined. And deep inside, he felt something else, a spark that whispered this was his moment. He stood slowly, every eye in the auditorium following him as he walked toward the stage. The laughter and whispers pricked his ears, but he kept moving until he reached the piano. The keys gleamed under the bright stage lights, waiting. The principal leaned back, smug, certain the boy would falter. But Jamal took a deep breath, placed his hands on the keys, and in that moment, he decided he would no longer hide. The story that unfolded next would shake the entire school to its core. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop as Jamal sat at the grand piano. The glossy black instrument shimmered under the lights, a centerpiece meant for virtuosos, not for a boy the principal had singled out as a joke. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for the embarrassment they assumed would follow. Principal Holloway crossed his arms, smugness radiating from his face as he prepared to enjoy what he thought would be a public humiliation. But then Jamal's fingers moved. The first notes were soft, delicate, and filled the auditorium with a sound so pure it caught everyone off guard. It wasn't clumsy or hesitant. It was precise, emotional, alive. The room that had moments before buzzed with suppressed laughter now grew utterly still. Parents tilted their heads, students stopped whispering, and even the teachers exchanged shocked glances. Something extraordinary was happening before their eyes, and no one had been prepared for it. Jamal didn't just play. He transformed. His back straightened, his eyes closed, and it was as if every ounce of his soul poured out through his fingertips. He wasn't reading sheet music. He wasn't stumbling. He was flowing, each note cascading into the next like water down a mountain stream. It was raw talent, the kind that couldn't be faked, the kind that couldn't be denied. The melody built, growing stronger and richer with every passing second. It carried the echoes of gospel hymns his grandmother used to sing, the rhythms of jazz he'd picked up listening to records his father loved, and the classical elegance he'd absorbed from YouTube tutorials and hours of practice. Jamal wasn't just playing the piano, he was telling a story. A story of struggle, of perseverance, of hope. A story of a boy who came from so little but carried within him something priceless. Gasps began to ripple through the audience. Students who had smirked now sat wide-eyed, their jaws slightly open. Parents who had dismissed Jamal as just another scholarship kid leaned forward, mesmerized. Even the teachers, seasoned educators who had seen countless student performances, couldn't hide their astonishment. This wasn't just good, it was brilliance. The music swelled, reaching a crescendo that seemed to lift everyone in the room. Some people felt chills run down their spines. Others felt their eyes well with unexpected tears. It was the kind of performance that reminded you of the power of art, of how music could transcend differences, silence prejudice, and speak directly to the human heart. Principal Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smirk that had been plastered on his face slowly faded, replaced by a frown as he realized his plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of humiliating Jamal, he had handed him the biggest stage of his life, and the boy was owning it. Worse yet, the entire auditorium was witnessing it. As Jamal's fingers danced across the keys, he thought of his family. He thought of his mother's tired smile after a 12-hour shift, his father's calloused hands gripping the steering wheel late into the night, his grandmother's voice as she encouraged him to never give up. Each note was for them, a thank you for every sacrifice, every lesson, every ounce of love they had poured into him. He thought, too, of the students who whispered behind his back, of the teachers who doubted him, of the principal who tried to use him as a punchline. This performance was his answer. Minutes passed, though to the audience it felt like only seconds. When Jamal finally struck the last chord, the sound resonated through the auditorium like a thunderclap, filling every corner of the room before fading into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence was thick, charged, almost sacred. And then applause. It started small, hesitant, from a few parents in the front row. But then it spread like wildfire. The clapping grew louder, stronger, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. Cheers erupted, whistles pierced the air, and the sound of hands coming together filled the room with an energy so powerful it seemed to shake the very walls. Jamal opened his eyes, stunned. He had expected ridicule, maybe pity. He had braced himself for laughter. But what he received instead was something he had never experienced at Westbrook. Respect. Real, undeniable respect. Some students shouted his name. Others looked at him with awe, their earlier assumptions shattered. Parents wiped tears from their eyes, whispering to each other about the boy who had just performed with the skill of a concert pianist. Teachers clapped so hard their palms stung. And in the middle of it all, Jamal sat frozen, overwhelmed by the realization that, for the first time since stepping foot in this school, he had truly been seen. Principal Holloway remained seated for as long as he could, but even he couldn't avoid the pressure of the moment. Reluctantly, he stood, joining the ovation, though his expression betrayed his discomfort. He had tried to make Jamal look small, but instead, Jamal had made the entire school look at itself. The hierarchy, the prejudice, the unspoken divisions, they had all been exposed in one unforgettable performance. Jamal rose from the piano bench, his legs trembling as he bowed slightly to the roaring crowd. Inside, he felt a rush of pride he had never known before. He had faced the moment that was meant to break him, and instead, he had turned it into triumph. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would ripple far beyond the walls of the auditorium. The performance would not only change how people saw Jamal, it would challenge the entire school to question what they valued, what they believed, and who they had chosen to lift up or push down. The boy who had been singled out as a joke was about to become the voice of something much greater than himself. Echoes of applause still rang in Jamal's ears as he walked off the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. The adrenaline refused to fade, every nerve alive with the energy of what had just happened. He had entered that auditorium expecting humiliation, yet he had left the stage to a standing ovation. But even as he tried to process the surreal experience, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following him, whispering, questioning, recalculating everything they thought they knew about him. In the crowded lobby after the performance, groups of students buzzed with conversation. For the first time since he had enrolled at Westbrook, Jamal's name was on everyone's lips, not as a target for pity or mockery, but as the center of admiration. Did you see his hands? He didn't even use sheet music. It was like professional level, like something you'd see at Carnegie Hall. I had no idea he could do that. None. Those who had been quick to dismiss him before were now struggling to reconcile their prejudice with what they had witnessed. The boy they had seen as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong in their polished world of wealth and privilege, had just commanded an entire auditorium in a way none of them could. Some of the parents approached Jamal, offering handshakes and words of praise. A mother told him his performance had brought her to tears, while another father admitted he hadn't heard piano played with that much emotion in decades. Jamal accepted the compliments politely, his quiet humility only deepening their admiration. But beneath it all, Jamal remained reserved. He knew not all of it was genuine. Some were impressed because of his talent, yes, but others were impressed because they had underestimated him so deeply. Meanwhile, Principal Holloway stood near the entrance, his jaw tight and his pride wounded. He forced a strained smile whenever someone mentioned Jamal's name, but inside he seethed. His carefully maintained order, the hierarchy he silently enforced, had been disrupted by a boy he had never considered more than a token scholarship case. And worse still, the entire school community had witnessed his failure. Later that evening, as Jamal walked through the nearly empty halls toward his locker, a group of students approached him. They weren't the friends he had hung out with quietly in the cafeteria. These were the kids who usually didn't give him the time of day, the athletes, the debate team stars, the ones who lived in mansions with chauffeurs waiting outside. One of them, a tall boy named Ethan, smirked as he leaned against the lockers. "Man, you really surprised us out there. Who knew you had that in you?" His tone carried something unspoken, a mix of respect and disbelief. Jamal shrugged. "I've been playing since I was 5. It's just part of me." Another student, Madison, chimed in, her eyes wide. "Part of you? Jamal, that was more than talent. That was genius. You should be performing in competitions, not just school events." Jamal smiled faintly, grateful for the kindness, but wary of their sudden shift. He had seen how quickly opinions could change in this school, how admiration could be just as conditional as acceptance. That night, when Jamal returned home, his parents were waiting eagerly. Word had already spread faster than he imagined. Parents who had been at the event had called others, and soon social media began to buzz. A video of his performance shaky, recorded on a phone, was already circulating. Comments flooded in. "Who is this kid? Incredible. Pure talent. This boy deserves a scholarship to Juilliard." His mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I always knew, Jamal. I always knew you had this gift. And now the world is finally seeing it too." His father clapped him on the back, pride shining in his eyes, despite the weariness of another long day at work. For Jamal, the recognition was overwhelming. For so long, he had lived in the shadows, quietly honing his craft, practicing late into the night, while the world assumed he was just another scholarship kid. Now suddenly, the spotlight was on him. And while it felt exhilarating, it also felt dangerous, because with every new admirer came the pressure of expectation. With every share, every comment online, came the reality that people would now see him differently. Some would celebrate him, but others, including Principal Holloway, would resent him even more. The next morning at school, Jamal walked into the building to an entirely different atmosphere. Students who had never acknowledged him nodded or waved. Teachers greeted him with newfound warmth. Some kids even asked if he would give them piano lessons. It felt surreal, like he had stepped into another version of Westbrook, where suddenly he belonged. But deep down, Jamal knew better. Belonging at Westbrook wasn't just about talent. It was about status, money, connections, and those were things he didn't have. What he had was his music. And now, everyone knew it. Principal Holloway called Jamal into his office later that day. The room was cold, lined with plaques and certificates that reflected the principal's obsession with prestige. Jamal sat quietly, waiting, as the principal folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward. "You surprised everyone yesterday," Holloway began, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. "I'll admit, I didn't expect that kind of performance. But don't let it get to your head. Talent is one thing. Discipline, respect, and knowing your place, that's another." Jamal didn't respond, but the message was clear. The principal wasn't congratulating him. He was warning him. What Jamal didn't yet realize was that his performance had lit a fire not just among the students, but in the entire community. Parents were talking, teachers were whispering, and opportunities that Jamal had never dared to dream of were quietly forming. But so too were obstacles, jealousy, and resistance from those who feared change. The boy who had been asked to play piano as a joke had not only shocked the jink, school, he had shaken its foundations. And this was only the beginning of the storm that was about to unfold. In the days following the performance, Westbrook High was no longer the same. The school's social dynamics had shifted overnight. For the first time, conversations in the cafeteria and hallways were not about the upcoming football game or who was running for student council president. They were about Jamal and the way he had commanded the piano with a brilliance no one saw coming. Students replayed clips of his performance on their phones, passing them around like a prized secret. Teachers stopped him in the hallways to tell him how impressed they were. Even parents who had never paid attention to him before suddenly wanted to know his story. To many, Jamal had gone from invisible to unforgettable in a single afternoon. But with admiration came whispers, and with whispers came envy. Some of his classmates celebrated him, eager to stand near the boy who had become the talk of the school. Others, however, began to feel resentment creep in. For years, Westbrook had prided itself on being a place where legacy mattered, where last names carried more weight than individual talent. And suddenly, here was Jamal, a scholarship kid with no powerful last name, no trust fund, no family influence capturing attention in a way none of them had in the locker room. Ethan muttered to a group of friends, "It's cool, yeah, but let's not act like he's better than everyone just because he can play piano." Another student added, "Exactly. My sister's been taking lessons for 10 years. No one throws a parade for her." Their voices carried an undercurrent of insecurity, resentment cloaked in casual words. Even among the faculty, opinions were divided. Mrs. Whitman, the music teacher, was ecstatic. She had known Jamal was talented, but she had never heard him perform like that before. She immediately began making calls, reaching out to colleagues in conservatories and music programs, telling them about the prodigy she had in her class. She believed Jamal could go far, perhaps even earn scholarships that could change his life, but not everyone was eager to see him succeed. Principal Holloway, still nursing the sting of his failed joke, began quietly undermining the excitement. In private conversations with parents, he framed Jamal's performance as a nice surprise, but not something the school should get carried away with. To him, Jamal's brilliance threatened the image of Westbrook as a place built for the elite. Meanwhile, Jamal tried to remain grounded. He continued his routine: early mornings, classes, homework, and long hours at the piano. Music had always been his escape, his safe place, long before anyone had cared. Now it felt different. Every note he played carried weight, as if the world was suddenly listening. Waiting, judging. One evening, Mrs. Whitman pulled Jamal aside after class. "I've been talking to some people," she said, her eyes glowing with excitement. "There's an audition for a regional youth symphony next month. It's competitive, but I think you're ready." This could open doors you never imagined. Jamal's eyes widened. Opportunities like this were the kind he had only dreamed about, the kind that seemed reserved for kids with private tutors and endless resources. The idea that he could stand on a stage in front of professionals, showcasing his gift, filled him with both hope and fear. At home, his parents encouraged him. His mother told him she had always believed music was his path, while his father reminded him that talent was only half the journey. Hard work and resilience would be the other half. Jamal listened carefully, absorbing their wisdom, but deep down he couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety forming in his chest. For the first time, his future didn't feel like a distant possibility. It felt like it was rushing toward him, faster than he could fully grasp. As news of his upcoming audition spread, so did the tension at school. Some students rallied behind him, offering words of encouragement and even promising to attend if they could. Others rolled their eyes, dismissing the attention as overblown. A few muttered that he was only getting these chances because people felt sorry for him, a cruel echo of the prejudice that had always lingered beneath the surface. And then there was Principal Holloway. Behind his polished smile, he was quietly planning. He couldn't stand the thought of this boy, this scholarship student, becoming the symbol of Westbrook. In his mind, Jamal's success would overshadow the very families and traditions the school was built to serve. And so, he began looking for ways to balance the narrative, as he put it. But Jamal, focused on the music, had no idea of the resistance forming in the shadows. He spent late nights at the old upright piano in his living room, practicing until his fingers ached. Every chord was a reminder of where he came from, every melody a vision of where he might go. He poured his soul into the keys, knowing that this audition could change his life forever. And yet, as the day of the audition grew closer, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the very place where he had shocked everyone, the halls of Westbrook High, was not finished. Testing him, the boy who had been asked to play as a joke was no longer just a curiosity. He was becoming a symbol. And symbols, as Jamal would soon learn, attract both light and shadow. As the weeks slipped by, the air around Jamal felt heavier with every passing day. The buzz from his piano performance at Westbrook High hadn't faded. It had only grown louder. Friends and strangers alike whispered his name in the hallways, his story spreading beyond the school into the community. Yet with that recognition came the burden of expectation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for him to prove himself again, to confirm that his talent was no fluke, no accident. The upcoming audition for the Regional Youth Symphony loomed large in his mind. It was all he could think about. Mrs. Whitman had arranged everything, securing his spot in front of some of the most respected musicians and educators in the region. To Jamal, it felt like an opportunity carved out of a dream. But dreams, he knew, could also become nightmares. At school, the pressure revealed itself in subtle ways. Some students, genuinely supportive, asked him what pieces he would be playing, eager to show they believed in him. Others, however, sharpened their words into weapons. "Better hope you don't choke," one student sneered as Jamal passed by in the cafeteria. Another muttered, "Let's see if he can play without making the school look bad." These barbs cut deeper than Jamal wanted to admit. But the real shadow came from Principal Holloway. Outwardly, he maintained his polished demeanor, praising Jamal's unique performance whenever parents or teachers were around. In private, however, he carried bitterness like a flame in his chest. To him, Jamal was a disruption to the order of things. Westbrook High was a place where reputation and privilege reigned, and here was a boy who had none of it, suddenly being hailed as the school's brightest star. One evening, long after the students had gone home, Holloway sat alone in his office. the faint glow of his desk lamp reflecting off his glasses. He looked over Jamal's file, his grades, his scholarship details, his financial aid. A thought gnawed at him. If Jamal's star rose too high, it would shift the narrative of the school away from the families he sought to please. He needed to remind everyone that the boy wasn't as flawless as they thought. The next morning, a rumor began to spread. Some students whispered that Jamal had only been admitted to Westbrook because of special treatment, that his scholarship wasn't based on merit but on pity. Others claimed that the audition Mrs. Whitman had secured for him was unfair, that she was playing favorites. The whispers traveled fast, carried by students who barely knew him but relished in repeating what they had heard. Jamal tried to block it out, burying himself in practice at home. His living room became his sanctuary, the upright piano his anchor. Every evening, after finishing homework and chores, he lost himself in the keys. Sometimes his little sister sat nearby, eyes wide with pride as she listened. His parents, though worried about the weight on his shoulders, reminded him of the strength he carried inside. "Don't let their voices drown out your own," his father told him. "Play for yourself, Jamal. Play because it's who you are." Still, doubt clawed at him. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he stared at his hands, wondering if they were truly enough. Could he really compete with kids who had been trained by the best teachers money could buy? Could a boy from his neighborhood, who had learned on a second-hand piano, stand shoulder to shoulder with the privileged children of Westbrook's elite? Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitman noticed the shift in the air. She saw the way some students avoided Jamal, how others mocked him under their breath. She even heard whispers among fellow staff, some questioning whether she was too invested in one student. But she refused to back down. To her, Jamal was more than a prodigy. He was proof that brilliance could bloom anywhere, even in the places people least expected. A week before the audition, the tension reached a breaking point. Jamal found a note slipped into his locker. The handwriting was messy, hurried. It read, "Stay in your lane. Don't embarrass yourself at the audition." For a moment, Jamal stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hand. He knew it was meant to scare him, to push him into silence. And for a split second, he considered it. He considered walking away, convincing himself that the world wasn't ready for him, that maybe it was better not to try. But then he remembered the look on his sister's face when she watched him play, the pride in his parents' eyes, the way the room at the school had fallen silent when his fingers touched the keys. He remembered the way the music had poured out of him, unstoppable, undeniable. That was who he was, not the whispers, not the rumors, not the intimidation dot on the night before the audition. Jamal sat at the piano with Mrs. Whitman by his side. She had come over after school to give him one last coaching session. As he played, she listened, her eyes glistening with a mixture of pride and urgency. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have something they can't teach," she told him softly. "You have soul. Let them hear it. Don't just play the notes, tell your story." Those words lingered in Jamal's heart long after she left. Alone in the quiet of his home, he sat at the piano, closed his eyes, and let the music flow. He poured his fears, his hopes, his entire being into the keys. It wasn't about impressing judges anymore. It was about showing the world the truth of who he was. And when the sun rose the next morning, casting its golden light across the city, Jamal knew he was ready. The stage awaited. The audition would not just be a test of skill, it would be a defining moment, one that could either confirm the doubts whispered around him or silence them forever. The day of the audition arrived with the kind of crispness that seemed to sharpen every sound in the air. The autumn wind swept through the streets of Brookdale, carrying with it the rustle of golden leaves. Jamal walked beside his parents, his heart pounding like a drumbeat that refused to settle. Dressed in his best button-down shirt and polished shoes, he looked calm on the outside, But inside, a storm raged. Every doubt, every cruel whisper, every lingering fear seemed to march with him toward the grand building where the auditions were being held. The regional youth symphony auditions were no small affair. The auditorium of the Brookdale Performing Arts Center was filled with parents, students, and judges who looked as if they had spent their entire lives in the presence of music. Posters of past symphonies lined the walls, showcasing young talents who had gone on to conservatories and careers. For Jamal, stepping into that space felt like crossing a threshold into another world. A world that wasn't built for him, yet one that he was determined to claim. Backstage, the tension was palpable. Dozens of other students waited with their sheet music, some pacing nervously, others practicing scales with mechanical precision. Jamal clutched his hands together, staring at the polished black piano that would soon become his battlefield. He caught glimpses of the judges through the curtain and women with stern faces, pens poised over clipboards. The whispers had followed him even here. He overheard two students snickering nearby. "Isn't that the kid from Westbrook? The one who's here on some charity program?" One said, just loud enough for Jamal to hear. The other chuckled. "This should be good. Let's see what happens when he tries to keep up with us." For a moment, Jamal felt his chest tighten. His throat went dry, and his palms began to sweat. The note he had found in his locker flashed through his mind. "Stay in your lane." The words clawed at his confidence, threatening to undo everything. He wanted to run, to escape before the weight of failure could crush him in front of everyone. But then, through the haze of anxiety, he heard a voice in his memory, Mrs. Whitman's words from the night before. "You have something they can't teach. You have soul. Let them hear it." The stage manager called his name. Jamal stood, his legs trembling, but he forced himself forward. Every step felt heavy, but also necessary. As he walked onto the stage, the lights hit him, blinding for a moment. He took his seat at the grand piano, the glossy surface reflecting his nervous face back at him. He could feel the audience's eyes pressing against him, waiting, expecting. The judges nodded, signaling for him to begin. Jamal closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the keys like birds preparing for flight. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, with deliberate grace, he pressed the first note. The sound filled the auditorium, rich, resonant, alive. Jamal wasn't just playing. He was speaking through the piano. Each note carried the weight of his story, the struggle, the doubt, the resilience. The judges leaned forward almost instantly, their pens forgotten for a moment as the music wrapped around them. The audience, too, fell into a hush, captivated by the depth pouring out of someone so young. Jamal's hands moved with a power that belied his trembling heart. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft as a whisper, sometimes crashing with intensity. It wasn't flawless, not in the rigid sense that others had practiced, but it was real. Every note carried emotion. Every chord told a truth. As he played, Jamal felt the whispers fade. The rumors, the snickers, the threats, all of it dissolved into nothingness. Here, on this stage, he was free. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was his voice, his shield, his declaration that he belonged. The final notes rang out, lingering in the vast auditorium before fading into silence. For a breathless moment, no one moved. The sound of his performance seemed to hover in the air, refusing to be forgotten. Then, like a wave breaking, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't polite or restrained. It was thunderous, uncontainable. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering, their faces lit with astonishment. Jamal sat frozen, his chest heaving, unsure if he was dreaming. He glanced toward the judges and saw something that sent a shiver through him. They were smiling. Not just nodding in approval, but smiling with genuine awe. Backstage, Some of the students who had mocked him now stood wide-eyed, their smugness replaced with disbelief. Even they couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. Jamal had not only matched their skill, he had surpassed it, in a way none of them could replicate. Among the crowd, Mrs. Whitman's eyes glistened with tears. She clapped harder than anyone, her heart swelling with pride. She had known Jamal was special, but even she hadn't fully anticipated the raw power of his performance. When Jamal stood from the piano, the applause continued. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. He had done it. He had poured his soul into the music, and the world had listened. But what he didn't know yet was that this moment was only the beginning. What came after the judge's decision, the way the community would respond, and the shocking shift in Principal Holloway's stance, would change everything in ways no one could have predicted. The auditorium still buzzed with energy long after. Jamal stepped away from the piano. Students whispered in disbelief. Parents exchanged stunned glances, and the judges spoke in hushed tones, their heads bent together as they scribbled furiously on their score sheets. Jamal sat in the waiting area, his chest still rising and falling quickly as the adrenaline coursed through him. He could hardly believe what had just happened. Minutes later, the head judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair, walked back on stage and tapped the microphone. The crowd hushed instantly, the kind of silence that carried weight. "We have witnessed extraordinary talent today," he began, his voice echoing across the vast room. But one performance stood apart, not simply for technical skill, but for soul, emotion, and brilliance that cannot be taught. The air grew thick. Jamal's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Then the judge said the words that would forever change his life. "The top spot in this year's auditions goes to Jamal Carter of Westbrook High School." The crowd erupted. Mrs. Whitman jumped to her feet, clapping so fiercely that tears rolled down her cheeks. Jamal's parents embraced each other, their pride radiant. And Jamal? He sat frozen for a moment, unable to process the reality. Then, slowly, he stood, his legs trembling, as the audience cheered his name. Back at Westbrook High, news of Jamal's triumph spread like wildfire. Students who had once mocked him now looked at him with newfound respect or envy. But the most shocking reaction came from Principal Holloway himself. The man who had tried to humiliate Jamal by turning him into the butt of a cruel joke was now faced with the undeniable truth. The boy he had underestimated had become the school's greatest source of pride. In a special assembly, the principal awkwardly congratulated Jamal in front of the entire school. His voice faltered as he spoke, knowing everyone remembered the way he had treated the boy just days earlier. But Jamal didn't let bitterness define the moment. He stood with dignity, offering a humble smile and a simple thank you. His grace silenced even the harshest critics. What no one expected, however, was the ripple effect Jamal's performance would create. Local newspapers picked up the story, marveling at the boy genius from Westbrook High. A video clip of his audition went viral online, shared by parents, students, and strangers who had never met him but felt moved by the raw passion in his music. Comments flooded social media. "This is why you never judge a book by its cover. He plays with more heart than professionals I've heard." This gave me chills. Suddenly, Jamal wasn't just a student on scholarship. He was a symbol of resilience, talent, and hope. Music schools reached out, offering him opportunities he had once only dreamed of. Invitations came for him to perform at events far beyond Brookdale. The boy who had once felt invisible had become a beacon, not only for his peers, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated. And yet, through it all, Jamal remained grounded. He still practiced late into the night, still helped his parents at home, still carried himself with humility. When asked in an interview how he managed to play with such emotion, Jamal answered simply, "Because I've lived it." Every struggle, Every doubt, it all comes out in the music. In the end, the real shock wasn't just his performance, it was the transformation it sparked. A school that once saw him as an outsider now celebrated him as one of their brightest stars. A principal who had tried to mock him had to face the shame of being proven wrong in the most public way possible. And a community that had once whispered behind his back now lifted him up as an inspiration dot as Jamal stood once. More at the piano during a school concert weeks later, the same auditorium filled with students and parents who had doubted him. He looked out at the sea of faces. This time, there were no smirks, no whispers, only eager anticipation. He smiled softly, placed his fingers on the keys, and let the music flow. The notes rose and swelled, a living testament to the truth that talent and determination know no boundaries of race, class, or circumstance. And as the final chord echoed, the audience erupted in applause again, this time not just for the boy at the piano, but for the lesson he had taught them all. Viewers of the story, too, are left with the same powerful message. Never underestimate the quiet strength within someone. Because sometimes, the very person the world tries to laugh at will be the one who shocks everyone with greatness. So now, dear viewer, let me ask you, how would you have reacted if you had been in that auditorium? Would you have believed in Jamal from the start? Or would you have been one of the doubters who laughed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that greatness can come from anywhere.